Let go of me, the child said, her voice so calm and so completely without fear that the flight attendant's hand froze in place. And then get ready, because I'm about to make a phone call that ends your career. But we need to go back to where this story actually began, because what happened on Flight 174 from Los Angeles to New York didn't start with a grab or a threat or a phone call made from 35,000 feet above the earth. It started in a terminal at LAX on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, with a man who moved through the world in a way that most people spent their whole lives trying to figure out. His name was Dominic Osei, and he was 44 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, and built like someone who had once worked construction and never fully left it behind. Even though the suits he wore now were tailored in Milan, and the watch on his wrist was worth more than most people's cars, and the airport he was walking through parted for him, the way airports parted for men who had earned a particular kind of quiet authority, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely and without question. His hands, though his hands still had the knuckles of a man who had built things with them. Real things, things that required effort and sweat, and the particular kind of determination that doesn't come from wealth because it has to exist before the wealth does. Otherwise, the wealth never arrives at all. And Dominic had learned that lesson the hard way over 2 decades of building a technology company from nothing into something that appeared on the covers of magazines and in the mouths of senators, and in the quarterly reports of competitors who had once laughed him out of their offices. Walking beside him, holding his hand in the loose and trusting way that only very young children hold their parents' hands, was Zoe. She was 8 years old, and she had her father's eyes, dark and steady, and full of something that most adults spend their whole lives trying to find, and she had her mother's cheekbones sharp and elegant, and she had inherited from nobody in particular a habit that was entirely and completely her own, which was the habit of watching everything, absolutely everything, with a quiet and total attention that missed nothing and forgot nothing, and filed everything away in a place inside her mind that was organized with a precision that should not have been possible in a child who still slept with a stuffed rabbit named Copernicus. She wore a white dress with small navy stars printed across the fabric, and her natural hair was pulled into 2 neat puffs on either side of her head, and she carried a backpack that was covered in embroidered constellation patches. Orion across the top pocket, Cassiopeia along the left strap, the Southern Cross stitched in silver thread near the bottom, because Zoe loved stars the way some children loved horses or superheroes, or the idea of becoming a veterinarian, which is to say, completely and without irony and with a depth of knowledge that made adults uncomfortable when she started talking about stellar classification at dinner parties. She had told her father once in the careful and precise way she said all the things that mattered to her, that stars were just suns that were too far away to be properly appreciated. And Dominic had sat with that sentence for 3 days before he repeated it to his board of directors the following Monday morning, as a metaphor for overlooked talent in emerging markets, and he had not told them where he heard it, because some things belonged to him and Zoe alone. They moved through the terminal together with the particular ease of 2 people who had made this trip many times before navigating the organized chaos of LAX, the announcements crackling over the intercom, the rolling luggage wheels clicking against tile floors, the smell of fast food mixing with jet fuel. Every time a door swung open, the particular density of human urgency that collected in airports and had nowhere to go except forward. And Zoe was doing the thing she always did in crowded places, which was observe. Her eyes moved from face to face with the quiet efficiency of someone reading a language that most people didn't know existed, and she noticed the gate agent at counter 12 whose smile changed slightly, depending on who approached her, warmer for some and more guarded for others. And she noticed the janitor near gate 47 who sang softly to himself while emptying a trash can. And she noticed the couple arguing in whispers by the window, the woman's jaw tight and the man's eyes darting sideways every few seconds. "Dad," she said, tugging his hand gently without breaking her stride. "That gate agent over there, she's been helping everyone who comes up to her. But she keeps looking over her shoulder first, like she's checking if someone's watching her. Dominic glanced in the direction she indicated, then looked back down at his daughter with the expression he always wore when she surprised him, which was a kind of quiet pride he tried not to show too obviously because he didn't want her to become self-conscious about a gift she had not yet fully understood was a gift. "What do you make of that?" he asked. Zoe thought for a moment in the unhurried way she approached all questions that deserved actual answers rather than quick ones. Either she's doing something she's not supposed to, Zoe said, or she's afraid of doing something she is supposed to. Either way, she's scared. "You've been reading those psychology books again," Dominic said. "They were on your shelf," Zoe said simply. "You left them where I could reach." "I'll keep that in mind," he said and smiled. The first-class cabin of Transcontinental Airlines Flight 1174 had the particular atmosphere that first-class cabins always had, a kind of muted, leather-scented luxury that existed at a slight remove from the rest of the plane, as if the people who occupied it had collectively agreed to pretend that flying was still glamorous, that it still meant something to arrive somewhere by air, and that the complimentary warm nuts and the extra 4 inches of legroom were evidence of a life well constructed rather than simply a ticket upgrade. Zoe settled into seat 2A with the practiced efficiency of someone who had flown enough times to have opinions about optimal window positioning and overhead bin strategy, and she was doing what she always did in new enclosed spaces with strangers, which was take inventory. The senior flight attendant for the first-class cabin was a woman named Claire Hartley, and Zoe noticed her within the first 60 seconds of boarding, which was not unusual because Zoe noticed everyone within 60 seconds. But Claire was the kind of person who rewarded attention, because there was something interesting happening in the gap between what she projected and what was actually occurring beneath it, like a signal running on 2 frequencies, simultaneously one audible and one not. She wore her platinum blonde hair in a severe French twist that had not a single strand out of place, and she moved through the narrow cabin with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this particular job so many thousands of times that it had stopped being a job and had started being an identity, the way some professions eventually consumed the people who practiced them until the job and the person became indistinguishable, and you could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. She smiled easily, remembered the names of frequent flyers without consulting her manifest, laughed at jokes in the way that people who are very good at their jobs laugh at jokes at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right amount of warmth. And if you were watching casually, if you were the kind of passenger who read the in-flight magazine and accepted the pre-departure drinks without looking up, you would have said she was excellent at what she did and moved on without a second thought. But Zoe was not watching casually, and Zoe noticed in the first 60 seconds something that she could not point to directly and say, "There, that is the thing," because it was not one thing. It was a frequency, a vibration running just below the surface of the professional performance, and what it was specifically was the way Claire's smile reached her eyes for some passengers and stopped just short for others in a way that was so subtle and so practiced it was probably invisible even to Claire herself. Zoe settled her backpack beneath the seat in front of her and opened the notebook she carried everywhere, small and spiral-bound with a dark green cover. The kind of notebook that was simultaneously ordinary and important in the way that objects become important when they are used consistently for things that matter. And she wrote the date and the time at the top of a fresh page, and then she wrote 2 words and stopped. Something is off. Watching. Her father called it her evidence journal, and she had started keeping it 3 years ago because he kept one himself, because Dominic Osei believed that memory was unreliable, but paper was honest, and that the most important things in the world were also the most vulnerable to being misremembered or forgotten or reshaped by time into something that had the shape of what happened but not the truth of it. She watched Claire move through the pre-departure service, and she noticed with the precision of someone cataloging data points, rather than collecting grievances, the way the flight attendant's movements changed depending on who she was serving quicker and lighter toward certain seats, with just a fraction more deliberateness toward others, and she wrote this down without editorializing, because editorializing was something you did after the evidence was complete, not during its collection. Across the aisle in seat 2B was a man she would later learn was named Darnell Wade, mid-40s, black-dressed sharply in a charcoal suit with the particular precision of someone who understood that in certain rooms, appearance was the first argument you made before you had said a single word. And she watched his jaw tighten briefly when Claire passed him twice without offering pre-departure drinks, and then she watched the professional mask settle back into place, smooth and practiced, like a door being closed on something that would not be acknowledged. She recognized that mask because her father had one, and had described it to her once on a night when she had asked him a question about being tired, that had turned into a conversation about something much larger and more complicated. And he had said, "You learned to wear it not because you stopped feeling things, but because you understood that certain rooms have no patience for your feelings, and you had work to do." She wrote Darnell's name down when she heard Claire address him finally, and she wrote down what she saw, and she kept watching. Once the plane reached cruising altitude and the first-class service began in earnest, Zoe settled into the quiet patient mode she used for long observations. The mode where she could sit completely still for extended periods without needing noise or distraction, because she had a sufficiently interesting interior life to occupy herself with, which her teachers had alternately described as a gift and a concern, depending on whether they had the tolerance for a child who was clearly thinking about something other than the lesson currently being delivered. She asked for water, and Claire passed her seat without pausing. She assumed this was an oversight and waited watching Claire serve the couple in row 3 and then move to the seats ahead and then pass back through the cabin with practiced ease, and she raised her hand politely the second time, and Claire glanced at her, just a glance, the briefest acknowledgement that she existed, and then turned to the man in 1A, an older white gentleman who had not raised his hand and had not asked for anything, and had been perfectly content with his current situation, and offered him a refill of his coffee with a full, genuine, unhurried smile. Zoe wrote this down. She tried a third time, speaking clearly and politely into the aisle as Claire moved past. "Excuse me, could I have a glass of water, please?" And Claire turned to look at her. Then, fully this time, and something moved behind her eyes that was not cruelty. Exactly. Not the sharp and obvious kind of cruelty that announced itself, but something more calculated and more mundane, and in some ways worse, which was the particular expression of someone who has decided without quite admitting it to themselves that certain people simply require less attention than others, and that this is not a moral failing, but simply an accurate assessment of priorities. "I'll get to you," Claire said in a tone that was professional and smooth and utterly dismissible, and then she moved on. Third request, acknowledged, not fulfilled. Time noted. Dominic was beside her with his reading glasses on and his quarterly reports on his tablet, in that deep focus space he occupied when numbers were in front of him. And Zoe did not tap his arm because she had made a decision she was going to handle this herself, at least for now, and she was going to document and understand exactly what was happening in this cabin before she said a single word to anyone, because incomplete evidence was worse than no evidence, and she needed the whole picture. 20 minutes into the flight, she watched Darnell flag down Claire to place his meal order, and she heard him clearly say that he wanted the salmon, the same item listed on the menu card. And she heard Claire write it down, and watched Darnell thank her with the quiet courtesy of a man who was not going to make this more complicated than it needed to be. 20 minutes after that, when the meal carts came through, Darnell received chicken. He looked at the plate with the particular stillness of a man who had been in this situation before, in various forms. And he looked up at Claire, and he said nothing for a long moment, and Zoe could see in that silence the full weight of a decision being made in real time, whether to make an issue of it and spend the next 2.5 hours in the accumulated awkwardness that would follow, or whether to absorb it quietly and accept the mathematics of the situation. And she recognized that calculation because her father had described it to her in almost exactly those words during one of their late-night kitchen conversations, that had started about something small and ended up somewhere much larger. The math you do in your head, he had told her every single time you decide whether to say something or just swallow it, and nobody ever talks about how exhausting that math is, because the people who don't have to do it don't know it exists, and the people who do have to do it are too tired from doing it to explain. "I ordered the salmon," Darnell said quietly, and there was no accusation in it, just the simple statement of a fact that had been true for 20 minutes and deserved to be stated. Claire tilted her head slightly and said that she believed the salmon had been the last item, which Zoe knew was not true, because she had watched Grace, the younger flight attendant, dark hair in a low bun, warm eyes, that had been doing something complicated since they reached altitude, serve salmon to the white man in seat 1C not 5 minutes earlier, and she wrote this down with the time noted. Claire's apology had the shape of an apology without the substance of one. It was built entirely from the correct vocabulary, the right words in the right order, and completely empty of any actual feeling, the way a house can have the right dimensions and the right address and still feel like nobody lives there. Darnell nodded once, looked down at his plate, picked up his fork, and the mask settled back into place. And then a woman came out of the lavatory near the forward galley, a black woman in her late 30s, beautiful in a purposeful and no-nonsense way that had nothing to do with performance, and everything to do with the particular confidence of someone who had built herself from the inside out, and she paused in the aisle, waiting to be directed back to her seat, and Zoe would later learn that her name was Dr. Simone Hayes, and that she was a physician traveling to New York for a medical conference, and that she had been in the lavatory because a passenger in row 4 had experienced a brief dizzy spell, and she had quietly identified herself as a doctor and offered assistance before everything settled, which was the kind of person she was. Claire walked past her twice without a word, without an acknowledgement, without even the courtesy of a glance. A white passenger who stepped into the same aisle 10 seconds behind Dr. Hayes was immediately escorted forward with a light touch on the shoulder and a soft right this way. Dr. Hayes stood there and watched it happen, and Zoe watched Dr. Hayes' face go through the same sequence of expressions she had seen on her father's face too many times to count the recognition. The quiet decision, the mask settling back into place, and something in Zoe that had been building quietly for the past hour went absolutely still. Not cold, not angry, still. The way her father went still when he had finished analyzing a situation and moved into action mode. She closed her notebook. She looked at her father. "Dad," she said. Dominic looked up from his reports. He saw her face. He had been reading every frequency of that face for 8 years, and what he saw now made him set down his tablet completely and take off his reading glasses and give her his full and undivided attention in the way that people gave attention when they understood something important was about to be said. "Talk to me," he said. "I need you to listen to something Zoe said, and I need you not to react while I'm telling you. I need you to just listen first." He looked at her carefully, searching her face for the specific frequencies that would tell him whether this was fear or hurt or something else. And what he saw was something else. Something he recognized because he had felt it himself 100 times in boardrooms and negotiations and conversations where the stakes were high and the margin for error was small. And what it was the particular clarity of a person who had made a decision and was now moving toward it with full intention. "Okay," he said. Zoe told him everything she had observed since they boarded, and she told it in the clean, sequential way. She told all things that mattered, the 3 water requests, and what had happened with each one, the way Claire had bypassed Darnell twice before someone else served him his drinks, the meal that came out wrong, even though the order had been clear, the moment in the aisle when Dr. Hayes had been left standing while a white passenger immediately behind her was assisted, and she held up her notebook as she spoke the pages of small, neat handwriting, with times and seat numbers and specific details recorded with a precision that should not have been possible in a 3rd grader, but was entirely natural to this particular child, because she had been trained by a man who believed that if something mattered, it deserved to be documented properly. She said it plainly without dramatics, the way she said all the things she was certain about as simple fact rather than accusation. Dominic looked at the notebook. He looked at Claire moving through the cabin ahead of them with her platinum French twist and her practiced efficiency and her smile that reached her eyes for some people and stopped short for others. He looked at Darnell Wade eating chicken he had never ordered. He looked at Dr. Hayes sitting very straight in 4A with the precise posture of someone who had decided not to let this ruin her afternoon, which was its own kind of exhausting decision to have to make. And then he looked at his 8-year-old daughter sitting there with her Constellation backpack and her green notebook and 4 documented incidents and a face that was calm and certain and completely without the particular kind of distress that would have made him reach across and take the problem from her hands, the way parents sometimes did with problems, because what he saw instead was not a child who needed rescuing, but a person who had already done something important and was now about to do something more. "What do you want to do?" he asked. This was one of the things Zoe loved most about her father, the fact that he never told her what to think, never reached in and solved the problem before she had the chance to be the one who solved it, never treated her age as a reason to take something out of her hands, rather than a reason to give her more time to figure out how to use them. He trusted her to have an answer, and she always had one. "I want to speak to her directly first," Zoe said, and her voice was steady and quiet and entirely without performance. "I want to give her a chance to apologize, not to me personally, but to the people she's treated this way on this flight. Not a policy language apology, a real one. I want you to let me do it, and I want you to let me do it alone." Dominic picked up his tablet from the seat pocket in front of him and placed it deliberately into the pocket, the gesture of a man setting down everything that was not this moment and giving this moment his complete and undivided attention. He put his reading glasses away. He turned to face forward in his seat with the particular stillness of a person who was prepared for something to happen. "You have the floor," he said. Zoe unbuckled her seatbelt. She stood. She stepped out into the aisle and walked forward 3 rows to where Claire was standing near the galley curtain, reviewing something on a small clipboard, and the overhead lights of the first-class cabin were soft and golden in the particular way they always were at cruising altitude, and the ambient noise of the aircraft hummed steadily around them, and Zoe stopped 2 feet in front of the flight attendant and said in her clear and unwavering voice, "Excuse me." Claire turned and looked down at the child standing in the aisle in front of her, and something shifted in her expression, a reflexive dismissal quickly dressed in the clothing of patience, and she said, "Honey, can you go back to your seat, please?" "I'll just be a moment," Zoe said, and her voice was so steady and so entirely absent of nervousness that the man in 3A, she would later learn his name was Judge Harold Finch, a retired federal judge from Sacramento, late 60s, silver-haired, the kind of man who had seen enough in 30 years on the bench that very little surprised him anymore, looked up from his magazine. "I need to speak with you," Zoe said, "about something that's been happening on this flight. I think that's the right thing to do, to address it with you directly first before anything else." Claire blinked. She had been working first-class cabins for 14 years, and she had encountered many things in those cabins, but she had not encountered this, and she did not immediately know what to do with it, which showed. Zoe held her notebook at her side and told Claire exactly what she had documented, the 3 water requests, each one named and timed the way Darnell had been bypassed when everyone else was served the meal that arrived wrong after a clear order, and the moment when Dr. Hayes had been left standing in the aisle, invisible, while the passenger directly behind her was immediately assisted, and she named the seat numbers and the approximate times, and she was specific and calm. And she did not raise her voice or waver from the quiet, steady register she had been using since she first opened her mouth. The cabin had gone quiet, in the particular way that cabins went quiet when something unexpected broke through the ambient noise, a collective holding of breath, a leaning in, a sudden awareness of something happening that deserved attention. And the man in 3A had lowered his magazine fully, and a woman in 4B was looking over her seat back. And Darnell Wade had turned his head just slightly in the aisle seat, not enough to commit to looking, but enough to hear every word. Claire stared at the child in front of her and cycled through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, then annoyance, then something approaching amusement. The specific amusement of someone who has decided this conversation is beneath them. And she said "sweetheart" in the tone that certain adults used when they had determined that the person speaking to them did not deserve to be taken seriously. "I don't know what you think you've been watching, but I have been doing my job." "I know what I've been watching," Zoe said, and the quiet in the cabin deepened by another degree. Claire's jaw tightened, and she said in a voice that had acquired a new edge, "You need to go back to your seat right now." "I'll go back to my seat," Zoe said, and she tilted her head slightly in the way she did when she was being very precise about something, her dark eyes absolutely level. "But before I do, I want to give you an opportunity. An apology to Mr. Darnell in 2B, and to the woman who was standing in the aisle, an actual apology. Not a policy language one, a real one. Because what I described was wrong. And I think you know it was wrong." She paused, and the pause had weight. That's all she said. A chance, because it's the right thing to do. Another pause, shorter this time. "But this is the last one." Claire looked at the child in front of her, and she looked at the notebook in the child's hand, and she looked at the cabin full of passengers who were no longer pretending not to listen, and something happened in her expression that should have been regret or fear, but was instead defiance. The specific defiance of someone who cannot bring themselves to believe they have done anything wrong, even when the evidence is standing directly in front of them in a white dress with navy stars and a backpack covered in constellations. "Get back to your seat," Claire said, cold and final. Zoe looked at her for exactly one more second, and then she nodded once slowly, the way her father nodded when a door had just closed on a negotiation and he was already thinking 3 steps ahead, and turned around and walked back to row 2. Sat down, buckled her seatbelt, and opened her notebook to a fresh page. Dominic looked at her. "Well." Zoe uncapped her pen. She said no. She said, "I heard," he said. So now Zoe said in the quiet and certain voice of someone who had expected this outcome and had already prepared for it, "I need your phone. The satellite one." Dominic reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a sleek black satellite phone, the kind of device that most people never owned, and some people never knew existed, a device that cost more than most people's monthly rent and worked at 35,000 feet above the earth without apology or explanation. And he held it out to his daughter with the particular gesture of a man who trusted the person he was handing it to completely. "You know the number?" he asked. "I looked it up 6 months ago," Zoe said, taking the phone with both hands in the careful way she handled things that mattered. "I wrote it in the back of my notebook. I thought I might need it someday. I just didn't know when." She opened the back cover of her notebook, read the number she had written there 6 months earlier. In her small, neat hand, dialed carefully and pressed the phone to her ear, and then she waited with the particular stillness of someone who had made a decision and was now on the other side of it in the place where there was nothing left to do but follow through. The cabin breathed around her in the way cabins breathed at cruising altitude. The steady hum of the engines, the subtle pressure of recycled air, the small ambient sounds of people existing in a confined space and 2 rows back. Darnell Wade had pushed his untouched chicken to the far edge of his tray table and was no longer pretending to work on his laptop because he had watched the little girl walk up to the flight attendant and say whatever she had said, and he had seen what had happened, and now this child was on a satellite phone. A satellite phone, not a cell, which meant this was not a child making a dramatic gesture, and the way she was holding it, the way she was sitting, The absolute stillness of her posture told him that this was something else entirely, something he did not yet have a name for, but recognized the shape of. Dr. Simone Hayes in seat 4. A had her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, and when Zoe had sat back down a few minutes ago, she had caught Zoe's eye briefly and something had passed between them. An acknowledgement woman to girl that crossed the gap in their ages without effort or explanation. The particular acknowledgement of two people who had just been part of the same thing, even if from different positions. In the forward galley, Claire Hartley was doing something with the serving napkins, folding them, refolding them, smoothing out creases that didn't need smoothing in the mechanical way of a person whose hands needed to be occupied because her mind was moving too fast and too hard, and she needed something physical to slow it down. Grace. Okonkwo, the younger flight attendant who had been on the route for 3 years, had gone back to check on Claire twice in the last 10 minutes, and both times Claire had said she was fine in the particular voice that communicated very clearly that she was not fine and did not wish to have a conversation about it, and Grace had gone back to the galley both times with the unsettled expression of someone who knew something was happening and had not yet decided what, if anything, she was going to do about it. In seat 3, a Judge Harold Finch had put his magazine down permanently and was sitting with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and his hands folded in his lap, watching the child in 2, A with the expression of a man who had spent 30 years presiding over cases in which the truth was contested and the stakes were high, and the outcome depended entirely on the quality of the evidence and the clarity of the person presenting it. And what he was seeing right now was making him recalibrate several things he had assumed about the situation when it first began. The hold music on the satellite line was the most ordinary sound in the world, a soft looping instrumental designed to make time feel like it wasn't actually passing the particular musical lie of corporate waiting. And Zoe listened to it without moving her notebook open on her lap. Her pen capped her expression exactly the same as it had been since she sat back down. She wrote one more line while she waited in her small and unhurried hand. Last chance declined, proceeding accordingly. Then she capped her pen and held the phone and did not move, and the hold music played and the plane flew on, and everyone who was paying attention, and by now a great many people were paying attention, could feel that something was happening in this small pressurized cabin that was not going to resolve itself the way small pressurized situations usually resolve themselves, which was by being absorbed into the ordinary fabric of a flight and disappearing before anyone had to do anything about it. The hold music stopped. Miss Osei said a male voice measured the voice of a man who had taken important calls before and understood how to begin them. "This is James Calloway. I understand this is urgent. What can I do for you?" Zoe sat up slightly straighter in her seat, not from nervousness but from precision, the way a musician straightened before the first note, not because posture was required, but because it helped, and she said, "Mr. Calloway, my name is Zoe Osei. I'm 8 years old. I'm currently on your Flight 1174 from Los Angeles to New York in first class with my father, Dominic Osei, and in the last hour and 20 minutes, I have documented a series of incidents involving one of your senior flight attendants that I believe you need to know about immediately." A brief pause on the line. I see Calloway said, "Go ahead." And Zoe went through it. She opened her notebook, not because she needed it. She had everything memorized with the precision of a child who had been trained to treat important information as something that deserved to be held properly in the mind rather than left lying around. But because she wanted the accuracy that came from reading documentation rather than reciting from memory. Because documentation was a record and memory was an interpretation, and right now she needed to be a record, not an interpretation. She gave Calloway the times. She gave him the names. She gave him the seat numbers. She described each incident in the clean, sequential way her father had taught her to present information to people who needed to understand something quickly and completely, not emotionally loaded, not accusatory in tone, not colored with editorial commentary, but factually organized in a way that built its own case without needing her to make arguments on its behalf, because the best evidence argued for itself if you arranged it correctly. 3 water requests, each one documented with the time and what happened immediately after. Darnell Wade in 2B bypassed twice for pre-departure drinks, while everyone around him was served. The meal substitution salmon ordered chicken received the specific language of Claire's response when it was raised. Dr. Simone Hayes, standing in the aisle, passed twice without acknowledgement, then immediately assisting the white passenger who entered the same aisle 10 seconds behind her. She gave him all of it, and when she finished, the line was quiet for 4 full seconds, which was longer than most lines stayed quiet after a report of this kind, and which told Zoe something about how the person on the other end of the line was processing what he had just heard. Miss Ose Calloway said, and his voice had shifted something and it had become more careful, more present in the way that voices became more careful when their owners had just understood that the situation they were dealing with was more significant than they had initially anticipated. "Can you confirm your father is on the flight with you?" "Yes, sir. He's sitting right next to me. May I speak with him for a moment?" Zoe looked at Dominic and held out the phone. Dominic took it. The exchange between the 2 men was brief and direct, the compressed shorthand of a conversation that didn't need many words, because both parties were operating at the same level of seriousness. Calloway asked Dominic to confirm what his daughter had described, and Dominic said every word of it was accurate, that Zoe had been documenting since boarding, that he himself had been watching for the last 30 minutes, and that this was not exaggeration of any kind. Another silence, shorter this time. And then Calloway's voice shifted again into the specific quality of hardness that professional composure acquired when the person behind it had just decided something. Dominic handed the phone back. "Mr. Calloway," Zoe said. "Miss Ose," he said. And there was something different in the way he said her name now. A weight that hadn't been there the first time. A seriousness that had been earned in the 2 minutes since she had begun speaking. "I want you to know that what you've described is unacceptable to me personally, and as the head of this airline. I want you to know that I take it with complete seriousness. And I want you to know that by the time this plane lands, there will already be people working on this." "Thank you," Zoe said. "And Mr. Calloway, I want to be honest with you about something. I gave her a chance first. Before I called you, I walked up to her and I told her exactly what I had observed, and I asked her to apologize, a real apology, not a policy one to the people she had treated that way. And she refused. I want you to know that because I think it matters. She had the chance to make it right herself, and I gave it to her and she declined." The silence on the line lasted longer than any of the previous ones. That Calloway said quietly with the particular tone of someone saying something he genuinely means rather than something that sounds good says a great deal about your character, young lady. "My father raised me right," Zoe said simply. She ended the call. She set the satellite phone on the armrest beside her. She picked up her pen and opened her notebook and wrote in her careful hand, "Call placed. 4:09 p.m. Calloway confirmed. Documentation transferred." She closed the notebook. And in that exact moment, as if the timing had been arranged by someone with a very specific sense of narrative inevitability, the galley curtain at the front of the first-class cabin pushed open and Claire Hartley stepped out into the light. She had collected herself during the time she had spent in the galley. Whatever storm had been moving through her in the past 10 minutes had been pressed back behind her professional composure and dressed in its usual clothing. And she walked out into the cabin with her shoulders squared and her smile restored to its default setting, carrying a small tray of warm cookies, the kind they served in first class at mid-flight, moving with the practiced ease of someone who was attempting to reset the atmosphere of a room without acknowledging that anything in the atmosphere had ever needed resetting. She did not look at seat 2A. She moved down the aisle. She served the couple in row 3. She served the man in 1A, She was 3 rows past Zoe when Darnell Wade said quietly but clearly in the deliberate voice of a man who had made a decision, "Excuse me." Claire turned, and Darnell looked at her with the steady, clear-eyed directness of someone who had been doing a calculation in his head for 40 minutes and had arrived at an answer he was prepared to act on. "My meal was wrong," he said, and there was nothing hostile in it, nothing escalating, just the simple flat statement of a fact that had been true for 40 minutes and deserved finally to be stated without apology. "I ordered the salmon. I received chicken. I'd like to know if there's anything you can do about that." Something moved through Claire's face, a flicker of something that she controlled quickly, but not quite quickly enough to prevent it from being seen by the people who were paying attention. And by now there were quite a few people on this flight who were paying attention. And she said in a voice that was very smooth and very professional, "I apologize for that, Mr. Wade. I'll see if we have anything left in the galley." "I'd appreciate that," he said. She turned to move forward and almost walked directly into Dr. Simone Hayes, who had stood up from her seat in 4A and was now positioned in the aisle with the particular composure of a physician, someone trained to remain level in situations that would thoroughly unravel most people, but who was also quite clearly and unambiguously standing, which was a statement in itself. Dr. Hayes did not raise her voice. She did not make a scene. She looked at Claire with the direct, clear-eyed gaze of a woman who had spent the last 40 minutes composing a question in her mind, and had decided after 40 minutes that the question deserved to be asked out loud rather than swallowed for the 101st time. "I want to ask you something," Dr. Hayes said quietly as a statement rather than a demand. "When I came out of the lavatory earlier and was standing in the aisle waiting to be directed to my seat, you walked past me twice without acknowledging me, and then you immediately assisted the passenger who had come in behind me. I'd like to understand why." Claire blinked. She had been a flight attendant for 14 years, and she had managed difficult conversations in cabins, and she knew how to handle complaints, and she knew the language of de-escalation. But what was happening right now was not a complaint in the traditional sense, and it did not respond to the standard de-escalation tools, because the woman standing in front of her was not angry and was not threatening and was not asking for anything except the truth. And the truth was the one thing Claire did not have a ready answer for. "I didn't notice," Claire said. "You did notice," Dr. Hayes said, and her voice was gentle in a way that made the words land harder than they would have if she had been aggressive about it. "Completely. I watched you notice me both times." She paused, and the pause was not hostile, just honest. "I'm not trying to embarrass you. I'm asking you a genuine question because I'd like to understand." The cabin was paying full attention now, and it was the particular quality of attention that cabins gave to moments that felt important, not rubbernecking, not voyeurism, but the quiet and serious attention of people who recognized that something real was happening in front of them, something that cut closer to the bone than the usual frictions of commercial flight. The man in 3A. Judge Harold Finch had put his magazine down so long ago it was on the floor beneath his seat, and he was watching Claire with the specific expression of a man who had listened to arguments for 30 years and recognized when someone was about to run out of them. Claire opened her mouth, and the words she started with were, "I assure you I treat all passengers." "That's not what happened," said a new voice, and everyone looked. Judge Finch was looking at Claire with the unhurried steadiness of a man who had no need to raise his voice to be heard, the steadiness of someone whose authority had been established over decades and did not require performance. "I've been watching this cabin since before we took off," he said. "And I'm a retired federal judge from Sacramento, which means I have spent 30 years listening to people tell me what happened, and then looking at what the evidence actually shows. And those two things are not always the same." He paused. "This child caught what was happening before I got around to doing anything about it, and I am not proud of that. But I watched it too. And the lady asked you a genuine question. You ought to answer it honestly. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that came after something true had been said out loud in a room where everyone had been thinking it privately, and the reverb of truth was still settling. Claire looked at Judge Finch. She looked at Dr. Hayes. She looked at Darnell. And then she looked briefly and involuntarily at Seat 2A, and Zoe was watching her, just watching notebook closed in her lap. And still the patient certainty in her eyes, sitting in a face that was composed and quiet and 8 years old and somehow entirely unintimidating and entirely impossible to dismiss simultaneously. Claire opened her mouth, and before she could say anything, Grace's voice came from the galley entrance. Claire. Low and urgent. Can I speak with you now? Claire set the cookie tray on the service cart. She followed Grace behind the curtain without another word. The curtain fell closed. The cabin exhaled. Darnell looked over at Seat 2A and studied Zoe for a moment. This small girl with the constellation backpack and the steady eyes and the green notebook, and then he said quietly, "Not as a performance." "Thank you." Zoe looked at him. "You don't have to thank me," she said. What she did was wrong. Somebody needed to say it. Somebody did. He said, and there was something in his voice that was more than gratitude, something that had more years behind it than the afternoon they were currently in. "I've been on 100 flights. Every single time I just let it go. It's easier." "I know," Zoe said. "My dad explained that to me." Darnell looked at Dominic, and Dominic nodded once, the particular nod of two men who understood each other's history without needing to narrate it, the shorthand of shared experience that didn't require translation. Judge Finch, who had fully committed to this conversation, now in the way that only retired federal judges could commit to conversations completely without reservation, with the particular thoroughness of someone who had spent decades believing that the truth deserved witnesses, asked Zoe what exactly she had written in the notebook if she didn't mind his asking. Zoe considered him for a moment, and then she opened the notebook to the first page of her observations and held it up so he could see it, small, neat handwriting covering the page. Times and descriptions and names and seat numbers, and the specific details of each incident recorded with a precision that made the older man go very still for a moment. "Good Lord," he said softly. "My father taught me," Zoe said. "If something matters, write it down. Memory is unreliable. Paper is honest." "Smart man," Judge Finch said. "The smartest I know," Zoe said. Behind the galley curtain, the voices had started muffled, but present in the way that muffled voices were always present in the small cabins of first-class sections where the walls were thin enough that you could hear the shape of a conversation even when you couldn't make out individual words. And what you could hear in the shape of this one was Grace's voice, low and urgent and persistent, and Claire's voice rising once and then falling again, and whatever was being said back there between those two women who had flown together for 3 years and had just arrived at a moment they would both remember differently for the rest of their lives. Claire came back through the curtain alone. She looked different from how she had looked when she went in, not destroyed, not undone. She still had the posture and the uniform and the exterior of someone who had been doing this job for 14 years and knew what she was supposed to look like in a difficult moment. But something behind her eyes had shifted, and the direction in which it had shifted was visible to everyone in the first-class cabin who was paying attention, and at this point, that was essentially everyone. She walked to Darnell Wade's row and stood beside his seat, with her hands at her sides and nothing in them, and she said in a voice that was different from her professional voice, flatter, less practiced, the voice of someone who had taken off one layer of performance and was operating from something slightly closer to the surface, "Mr. Wade, I owe you an apology. Your meal order was wrong, and that should have been corrected immediately. I'm sorry." Darnell looked at her with the evaluating stillness of a man who had heard many apologies and had learned to test their weight before accepting them. "Is that the whole apology?" he asked. She held his gaze by the thinnest possible margin. I know that some of my behavior on this flight has not been what it should be, and I'm sorry for that as well. It was not a full confession. It was not the complete and honest reckoning that Zoe had asked for, but it was something a crack in a wall that had been standing for a very long time, and even a crack was a different thing than a solid surface. Darnell gave a short nod that was not absolution but was acknowledgement, and that was the appropriate thing to give in exchange for an apology of that particular weight. Claire turned to face Dr. Hayes, who was still standing in the aisle with the quiet patience of a woman who had decided to wait for what was coming rather than go looking for it. "Dr. Hayes," she said, using the title for the first time all flight, which Zoe noted and wrote down. "I apologize for not assisting you when you were waiting in the aisle. That was wrong of me." Dr. Hayes looked at her for a long, level beat. "I appreciate you saying that," she said, and paused. "I hope you mean it." Claire did not respond to that because there was no good response to it, and she turned instead toward seat 2A, and the whole cabin felt the shift in gravity that came with the turn, the particular weight of a moment that had been building for over an hour and had finally arrived. She walked to row 2. She stopped beside Zoe's seat. She looked at the child, and whatever she had rehearsed behind that curtain, whatever words she had assembled in the 2 minutes she'd spent trying to figure out how to do this, seemed to collapse before it could reach her mouth, because Zoe was looking at her with something that dismantled prepared speeches simply by being what it was. There was no anger in Zoe's eyes, no triumph, no satisfaction of the kind that the situation might have seemed to earn. There was just the steady, quiet watchfulness that had been there since boarding, and something else, something that should not have been possible in the face of an 8-year-old who had spent an hour being ignored and dismissed and physically grabbed, but was there nonetheless, fully formed and entirely genuine. And what it was the simple and unperformed hope that the woman standing in front of her would find the right thing to say. "You don't have to do it for me," Zoe said before Claire could start. Her voice was quiet and careful and completely without edge. "I want you to do it because you understand that it was wrong. Not because you're in trouble, not because of who my father is. Because it was wrong, and the people you treated that way deserve to hear it from you. That's the only apology that means anything." Claire was quiet for 3 full seconds. "And then I treated people on this flight as less than what they are." Her voice was slower now, each word its own weight. "I can't take that back. But Her voice caught just once, briefly, and she pressed it back down, the way people pressed down things that had been waiting too long to come up. "I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry." Zoe looked at her for a long moment, the way you looked at something when you were deciding whether it was true, and then she nodded once with the same slow deliberateness her father used when he nodded at the end of something that mattered. "Okay," she said. Claire walked back to the galley. The curtain fell closed behind her and the cabin. The whole first-class cabin began to breathe again, slowly and collectively, like something that had been held underwater for an hour had finally been let up to the surface. Judge Finch cleared his throat. That was something he said to no one in particular. "Doctor." Hayes sat back down in her seat and picked up her tea, which had gone completely cold, and held it in both hands and stared at nothing for a moment. And then she looked over at Zoe with an expression that was too full to be any single thing. "How old are you, really?" she asked. Zoe smiled, and it was the first time she had smiled since before boarding, and it transformed her face in the particular way smiles transformed the faces of children who had been working very hard at something serious. 8.5, she said. "My birthday is in March." Dr. Hayes shook her head slowly, the specific headshake of someone encountering something they did not entirely know how to process. "My dad says age is just how long you've been practicing," Zoe said. "Some people practice well, some people don't." Darnell laughed. A real laugh. surprised clean out of him, the kind of laugh that broke the last of the tension in a room the way a window opened in a stuffy space broke the last of the stale air, and Dr. Hayes joined it, and Judge Finch made a sound that for a retired federal judge was extremely close to laughter, and even the passengers in rows 4 and 5 who had been listening carefully for the last hour were smiling in the cautious, warming way of people who were realizing they had been present for something unusual and were only now letting themselves feel the relief of it. The warmth lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Zoe was watching the clock on the bulkhead as she watched most things, and then Grace Okonkwo came through the galley curtain again, and her face was carrying something different from the relieved openness of someone who had just watched a difficult situation resolve itself towards something honest, something harder than that, and a little frightened the face of someone who had received information she had been turning over in her hands since before she came through the curtain and still wasn't sure how to carry it. She came directly to seat 2A, and she crouched down beside Zoe's seat in the deliberate way, not the automatic crouch of someone talking to a small child, but the intentional crouch of a person who had decided that what she was about to say deserved to be said at eye level, and the gesture was so specific and so deliberate that the people who saw it understood immediately that whatever was about to happen was not incidental. "I need to tell you something," Grace said, and her voice was low enough for the immediate rouse and no further. "I don't know if I should, but I think you deserve to know." Dominic leaned in slightly from the adjacent seat. Zoe was very still. "This isn't the first time," Grace said, and she said it in the way that people said things they had been not saying for a very long time, with a particular quality of release. The release of someone setting down something heavy that had been pressed against their chest for so long they had almost forgotten it was there. "What happened today, it isn't new. I've been flying with Claire for 3 years. I've seen it before. Different flights, different passengers. The same pattern." She paused, and in the pause, Zoe could hear the weight of everything. Grace wasn't yet saying the 3 years of looking away. The 3 years of telling herself it wasn't her place. The 3 years of accepting the mathematics of being new and junior and afraid. "I never said anything," Grace said. "I kept telling myself I didn't know for sure, that it wasn't my place to get involved, that it was just easier to focus on my own section and not see what I was seeing. I was wrong." She exhaled. "Nobody has ever made her face it before. Nobody ever did what you did today." Zoe looked at her carefully, the way she looked at everything that was important. "Did you write any of it down?" she asked. "The other times?" "No." "Would you be willing to write it down now? Everything you remember, the dates, the specifics, whatever you can recall. Mr. Calloway is going to need more than one incident. He's going to need a record that shows this isn't isolated." Grace stared at her. She looked at Dominic, who met her gaze with the quiet steadiness of a man who was not going to make this decision for either of them. She looked back at Zoe. "You already called the CEO," she said. "Before the apology. I wanted to make sure the record existed regardless of what she said afterward," Zoe said. "If she had apologized the way I asked her to, the documentation would still exist, but might not need to go further. She didn't, so it does. Either way, the record needed to be there." Grace was quiet for a long moment, and in the quiet, Zoe watched something happen in the younger woman's expression. A dawning, the specific expression of someone who had just understood how seriously they had underestimated a situation, but also something else beneath the dawning, something that had been waiting for a long time for exactly this kind of opening. "Yes," Grace said finally. "I'll write it down. Everything I remember." She stood and walked to the jump seat near the front of the cabin, not back through the galley curtain, not behind any partition, but right there at the front of the first-class section where everyone could see her, and she reached into the pocket of her uniform and pulled out a small notepad and uncapped a pen and started writing. Zoe looked out the window. The light was changing the particular golden angle of late afternoon that meant the day was bending toward evening, and New York was getting closer, and she opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote, "Grace coming forward." Pattern established. Documentation expanding. She looked at her father. "Dad," she said quietly, and he looked at her and she said, "When we land, I think we're going to need a lawyer." Dominic looked at his daughter, his 8-year-old daughter who had been managing this situation with the composure and precision of someone 3 times her age who had sat quietly and documented everything before she acted, who had given Claire a genuine chance before she escalated, who had gotten Calloway on the line before the apology, so that the record existed regardless of outcome, who was now anticipating the next 4 steps, before she had finished walking through the current one. And something moved across his face that was not surprise because he had stopped being surprised by her a long time ago, but was instead a kind of pride, so deep it sat in the body rather than the face. "I've already sent a message to 3 of them," he said. Zoe nodded as if this was exactly what she had expected, which it was. "Good," she said. And on the jump seat at the front of the cabin, Grace Okonkwo's pen moved steadily, and Zoe watched the clock on the bulkhead and counted, and Grace did not stop writing for 11 minutes. When Grace came back to seat 2A, she was carrying the notepad in both hands, with the careful deliberateness of someone transporting something fragile, and she held it out to Zoe and said 4 incidents. Different flights, different passengers. 2 of them I can name with the flight numbers and dates because I keep my own scheduling logs. The other 2 I remember clearly, but I didn't document them at the time." She paused, and the pause had the quality of an admission. "I should have." Zoe took the notepad and read it carefully, not quickly, not scanning, but carefully, the way her father read contracts, tracking every sentence for what it said and what it didn't say, and what the gap between those 2 things might mean for someone who needed to rely on it. And when she finished, she looked up at Grace. "This is good," she said. "This matters." "Does it help?" Grace asked. "It turns one incident into something that shows this has been happening for a long time," Zoe said. "That's a completely different conversation." Grace nodded, and she looked like someone who had made a decision and was only now beginning to feel the full weight of what that decision was going to mean for everything that came after it. Not regret, but the particular feeling of standing at the edge of something that could not be undone. "I want you to know something," Grace said, and her voice was different now, less professional. The voice of someone who was being honest at a cost. "I liked this job. I was good at it. I kept telling myself that staying quiet was just professionalism, not my place to get involved, not my conflict to enter. But the truth is, I was afraid of her. She has been here 14 years, and I've been here 3, and I just..." She stopped. "That's not an excuse." "No," Zoe agreed. "But it's a reason. There's a difference." She looked at Grace with the steadiness she used for things that deserved to be said clearly. "You're doing the right thing now. That counts." Grace straightened, nodded once, and went back to the jump seat. Dominic had been reading over Zoe's shoulder, and he sat back now in the particular way he sat back when he was thinking, not relaxing, but settling into the architecture of a problem he was building in his mind. 4 incidents, he said quietly. 3 years, different flights. That's not just one bad day, Zoe said. No. Dominic agreed. That's a pattern built into the fabric of how she does the job. That's a legal matter. Zoe looked at him. Is that okay, baby? He said with the particular gentleness he used for the things that were most important, you call it. This is your case. In the galley behind the half-drawn curtain, Claire Hartley was on her personal cell phone, which technically wasn't supposed to be in use during the flight, a fact she knew perfectly well, and she was typing fast with her back to the cabin, her shoulders angled forward in the specific posture of someone who understood that time was running short, and that whatever protection she could arrange needed to be arranged now before the plane landed and the clock became something she could not control. She was composing a message to her union representative. In the cabin, without anyone coordinating or directing them, the witnesses had begun doing something that Zoe noticed and wrote down immediately. Because it seemed important and possibly significant, they were documenting themselves. Judge Harold Finch had produced his own small notepad from his breast pocket and was writing in the deliberate, unhurried hand of a man who understood exactly what documentation looked like in a formal context and was constructing his carefully. Darnell Wade had his phone out recording a voice memo with his hand partially covering the device, speaking quietly and methodically into it, recounting his experience in the specific sequential way of someone who had been in enough professional situations to know that details mattered and that memory degraded, and that if this was going to matter tomorrow, it needed to be captured accurately today. Dr. Simone Hayes was typing steadily in her notes application, her thumbs moving with the practiced speed of a physician accustomed to writing records quickly and precisely. Nobody had asked them to do this. Nobody had coordinated it. They were doing it because something in what had happened in this cabin over the last 90 minutes had moved them from passive witnesses to active ones, and the transition from one to the other was something that had happened not because of an instruction, but because of a presence. The presence of an 8-year-old girl sitting in 2A who had shown them by example that the thing you saw deserved to be written down. Zoe wrote witnesses documenting independently, not coordinated, significant. She underlined significant and circled it. The galley curtain moved again, and this time the energy that came through it with Claire was different from anything she had brought into the cabin before. Not the collected professionalism she had reassembled before the apology, not the tight-wound uncertainty of someone navigating a situation she hadn't planned for, but something newer and harder, and with the specific quality of a person who had just received instructions from someone they trusted, and was now operating on those instructions rather than on their own judgment. Her chin was up. Her shoulders were set. She walked down the first-class aisle with the deliberate, measured pace of someone who had made a decision and was committed to following it through, and she stopped beside Zoe's seat in row 2 and looked at Zoe and said in a low and controlled voice, "I need to speak with you and your father." Dominic looked up. "Whatever phone calls have been made," Claire said, keeping her voice at a register that was meant to be private but was audible to the immediate rows, "and whatever you think is going to happen when this plane lands, I want to be clear about something. I have 14 years with this airline. I have an exemplary record. I have colleagues who will speak to my character, and I have a union representative who has advised me that there may have been some misunderstanding today about the nature of—" There was no misunderstanding. The voice came from 3A, and it was so unhurried and so completely without drama that it cut through the cabin more effectively than a raised voice would have. Judge Harold Finch was looking at Claire pleasantly in the way that only people who had once held a gavel looked pleasant when making serious points. "I'm a retired federal judge from Sacramento," he said. "I've presided over discrimination cases for 30 years. I know what a misunderstanding looks like, and I know what one doesn't look like, and I've been watching this cabin since before we left the ground." He paused. "This child caught what was happening before I got around to doing anything about it, which is not something I'm proud of. But I watched it, and I want to be transparent with you. I would recommend strongly against that particular line of argument." He smiled the way only retired federal judges smiled, with the quiet, absolute confidence of someone who had no need to persuade anyone of anything because the facts did the persuading for him. Claire looked at him. Something moved in her expression, a recalibration rapid and involuntary, a reassessment of the room she was standing in and the people she was standing in front of, and she said carefully, "With respect, the child documented everything in real time." Judge Finch continued in the same pleasant and unhurried voice as if Claire had not spoken. "The flight attendant on your own crew has produced a written corroborating account. 2 other passengers are actively creating contemporaneous records of their experiences as we speak." He gestured slightly toward the notepad in his own hand. "And the CEO of your airline received a comprehensive briefing approximately 40 minutes ago." He set the notepad down on his tray table. "That's not a misunderstanding. That's a case. The word landed in the first-class cabin the way certain words landed in certain rooms, with a weight that went beyond its syllables, that compressed everything the situation had accumulated over the last 2 hours into a single sound that everyone present could feel. Claire looked at the retired judge. She looked at Darnell, who was watching her without expression. She looked at Dr. Hayes, who was watching her with the same clear, unafraid directness she had used in the aisle. And then she looked at seat 2A. The involuntary look, the look she could not quite prevent, and Zoe was watching her with the patient, steady attention that had been her expression for most of this flight notebook, closed on her lap hands, still completely without anger or satisfaction or triumph, just watching, and somehow that was worse than any of the other things it could have been. "You're 8 years old," Claire said, and this time the words came out differently than they had before, not as dismissal, not as ammunition, but as something closer to a question, as if she was still trying to reconcile the child in front of her with the reality of the situation she was standing in. "Yes," Zoe said, "and I have your name. The date, the flight number 4. Corroborating witnesses, including a retired federal judge, a physician, and a senior businessman, plus a written statement from your own colleague documenting 4 separate incidents across 3 years, and the direct satellite number of your CEO, who I spoke with personally for 6 minutes, at 4:09 this afternoon." She paused in the exact way her father paused when he was about to say something that deserved to arrive in its own space. My age has never been relevant to any of that. The first-class cabin was absolutely silent, in the way that first-class cabins became silent when something had been said that could not be unsaid, and everyone present understood that the shape of the moment had permanently changed. Claire opened her mouth. She closed it. She turned and walked back to the galley without another word, and the curtain swung shut behind her, and Judge Harold Finch looked at Zoe Osei with the expression of a man who had spent 30 years watching arguments made in his courtroom by people who had gone to the best law schools in the country and had just heard the cleanest and most precise argument of his professional life from someone who had not yet turned 9. "Young lady," he said quietly, "you have a future." "Thank you," Zoe said. "But right now I have a landing to prepare for." She looked at Dominic. "I need your phone again." This time she did not call Calloway. She dialed a number from Dominic's contacts. Patricia Adeyemi, lead partner at the Civil Rights Division of a firm Dominic had retained for 3 years. A woman who answered on the second ring when Dominic's satellite number appeared on an afternoon call, because the combination of that number and that time of day meant something was happening. And when something was happening, Patricia Adeyemi was the kind of person you wanted on the line before you had finished explaining what it was. Patricia, Zoe said, "It's Zoe. I'm on a plane, and I need to brief you on something before we land." A single beat of silence, and then Patricia's voice sharpened into its professional register with the efficiency of someone flipping a switch. "Go ahead." "Oh." Zoe briefed her in 4 minutes, clean and sequenced and specific, the way she had briefed Calloway, and Patricia interrupted twice, once for the flight number and once to confirm the name of the flight attendant who had come forward. And when Zoe finished, Patricia said, "Who else was on the call with Calloway? Any third-party witness?" "Just me." "My father spoke with him briefly to confirm." "Good. Don't say anything else to any airline staff before I get to the gate. I will be there when you land." A pause that had assessment in it. "Zoe, you did everything right. Just hold the line." "Yes, ma'am," Zoe said. She ended the call. She looked at the time, 4:58 p.m., 31 minutes to landing. She handed the phone back to Dominic and sat back in her seat, and breathed, genuinely breathed for the first time in what felt like a very long while, not the careful, measured breathing she had been doing since the flight reached cruising altitude and she had shifted into documentation mode, but actual breathing, the kind where you felt your lungs expand all the way. Darnell leaned slightly into the aisle. Was that a lawyer? Yes, Zoe said. He absorbed this, and then he looked at Dominic with a look that had a great deal in it. Then he looked back at Zoe. My son is 11, he said. Can she give him some pointers? I have a reading list, Zoe said. Darnell laughed the same surprised, genuine laugh from before, the laugh that lived in a different register from anything performed, and Dr. Hayes joined it, and Judge Finch made the sound that was close enough to laughter for a retired federal judge, and even the passengers in rows 4 and 5, who had been quiet witnesses to the entire afternoon, were smiling. The warmth lasted exactly 4 minutes before Grace came through the curtain again with a frightened face, carrying new information. Claire had made a phone call. Grace had caught only part of it, but Claire had said that she had information about the Osei family that would change the story. Dominic went very still. He looked at Grace with calm, level eyes. Thank you, he said, genuinely. Grace went back to the front. Dominic looked at Zoe. Zoe was already looking at him. Whatever she says, Zoe said quietly, thinking out loud in the way she thought when she was working through something that mattered. Whatever she finds or makes up, it doesn't change what I watched her do today. Right. Not by one word, he said. Zoe opened her notebook. She wrote, Claire made a call. Claims to have information about our family. Likely deflection. Patricia advised, hold the line. And then, on the next line, smaller and more deliberate. Don't let her make this about Dad. Keep it about what I saw. She underlined it twice. The seatbelt sign came on with its familiar, soft chime, the captain's voice arriving over the intercom with the standard approach announcement. Local time in New York, temperature on the ground, estimated arrival. The courtesies that signaled the journey was ending, and the destination was approaching, and the first-class cabin responded with the choreography that first-class cabins always performed at this point. Laptops, folding items being stowed, the ambient sounds of people reassembling themselves for arrival. In seat 2, a Zoe sat completely still. Her seatbelt was already fastened. Her tray table was already in its upright and locked position. Her backpack was already stowed beneath the seat in front of her. She had been ready for the next phase since the moment she ended the call with Patricia, because she was the kind of person who was always ready for the next phase before the current one had concluded, which had been true of her since she was 5 years old, and had packed her own bag for a family trip with a handwritten checklist she had made the night before. She looked out the window. The clouds had broken, and through the gap she could see the coast, the exact place where the land met the water, in the particular way it did on the approach to JFK, the specific geography of arrival that she had seen dozens of times and which never looked entirely the same twice, and which always made her feel something small and important about the size of the world. She felt her father's hand cover hers. She looked at him. "Whatever happens when we get off this plane," he said, and his voice had the particular quality it had when he was choosing his words carefully rather than reaching for the closest available ones. "I want you to know something." She looked at him and waited. "I have spent 20 years building things," he said. "Companies, systems, things that I believe matter and that I believe will last. And I have never in all of that, in all of those years, in every room I have walked into and every decision I have made, never been as proud as I am sitting in this seat right now." Something moved behind Zoe's eyes, something young and soft and entirely unguarded, the part of her that was underneath all the composure an 8-year-old girl who had been holding herself very carefully for a very long time, and who needed simply and without anything complicated attached to it to know that her father thought she had done well. "Even though I got you into a legal situation?" she asked. "Especially because of that," he said. She leaned her head against his arm just for a moment, just long enough to be a child, just long enough to be small, without it meaning anything except that she was also small. And then she sat back up. Judge Harold Finch stood and buttoned his jacket with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been putting himself together at the end of things for decades, and he reached into his breast pocket and produced a business card. Not a corporate one, a personal one, just his name and a direct number, and he leaned across the aisle and held it out to Zoe with the gravity of someone who understood that certain gestures were also statements. "If anyone needs a witness statement," he said, "use that number. Anytime." He paused. "You did a hard thing today. The right way. Not everyone manages that combination." Zoe took the card. "Thank you, Judge Finch." He moved toward the exit, and Darnell was next pulling his bag from the overhead and looking at Zoe in the way people looked at things they intended to remember. "My son's name is Marcus," he said. "I'm going to tell him about today." A pause. "Tell him Zoe said that the math of deciding whether to say something is always going to be hard, but you can get better at it." Darnell absorbed this slowly in the way of a man filing something away in a place that would hold it permanently. He nodded once, extended his hand, and Zoe shook it with the seriousness it deserved. Dr. Simone Hayes was last of the three. She stood in the aisle with her carry-on over her shoulder and her eyes full of too many things to name individually: gratitude and recognition, and the specific kind of grief that arrived when you understood how long something had been wrong and how long you had been absorbing it quietly without putting those two facts in the same sentence. "I'm a physician," she said. "I save lives. That's my entire thing. And today an 8-year-old girl had to fight a battle on my behalf because I had already decided it wasn't worth fighting." She paused. "I'm not going to do that again." "Good," Zoe said simply. Dr. Hayes smiled wide and real and entirely unguarded, the smile of someone who has just made a commitment and feels the relief of it, and said, "Happy birthday in March." "Thank you," Zoe said. The wheels touched down at JFK at 5:22 p.m., 7 minutes ahead of schedule, as if even the aircraft understood that what came next could not afford to wait. The seatbelt sign chimed off, and the cabin moved the immediate surge of standing passengers overhead bins, opening the ambient soundtrack of 100 people reassembling their lives. And in the first-class cabin, the process was quieter and more deliberate. The movements of people who had shared something unusual for the last 2 hours and were not entirely sure how to transition back to the ordinary business of deplaning. Dominic stood and held out his hand to Zoe, and she took it, and together they walked toward the front of the plane past the passengers who were still arranging their things, some of whom glanced toward them in the particular way people glanced at the center of something they had witnessed but not fully processed yet. Claire Hartley was standing near the exit door. She was required to stand there as she had been required to stand near every exit door of every flight she had worked for 14 years. Protocol, one of the many protocols that had shaped her days so completely that she had sometimes forgotten they were choices rather than inevitabilities. She looked at Zoe as she approached, and Zoe stopped. She looked at Claire the way she had been looking at important things all afternoon. Not with triumph, not with coldness, not with the satisfaction that might have seemed earned by the afternoon's events, but with the simple, unflinching attention of someone who saw clearly and had decided that clarity was the most honest thing she could offer. There was no performance in it. There was no message she was trying to deliver. It was simply seeing. "I hope you figure it out," Zoe said quietly. "For real. Not just because of the consequences, for your own sake. For real." Claire said nothing. Her jaw worked once. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with her professional composure and everything to do with something that had been pressed down for a long time and was finding the gaps. Zoe walked off the plane. The jetway was cool and bright, the air different from cabin air in the way that outside air was always different, less controlled, less recycled, carrying the particular density of a New York afternoon, and Dominic walked beside her with steady steps, and neither of them spoke for the length of the jetway because they had said the important things and the rest could wait. Through the glass walls at the end of the jetway, the gate area was visible, and standing just beyond it already, there, already watching, already in motion, in the focused and purposeful way that was entirely her own, was Patricia Adeyemi. She was tall, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, a legal pad in one hand and her phone in the other, wearing a dark suit that said she had come directly from something important to something more important. And she had the expression on her face of a woman who had known Zoe Osei since the girl was 4 years old, and had watched her grow up across years and dinners and casual conversations, and yet had never not once seen her like this. She crouched as they came through the gate, the same deliberate eye-level crouch that Grace had used in the cabin, the crouch that said, "What you have to say is worth lowering myself to hear." And she looked at Zoe with full and serious attention, the concentrated attention of someone who wanted this unmediated and unfiltered and exactly as it had happened. "Tell me everything from the beginning," she said. "Your words, your order. Don't leave anything out." Zoe opened her green notebook. She began. Behind the galley curtain of Flight 174, which was now parked at its gate and being serviced by the ground crew who moved around it with the ordinary efficiency of people doing a job that had nothing to do with the afternoon's events, Claire Hartley sat alone in the jump seat. The curtain was closed. Grace had gone to handle the deplaning process at the rear of the aircraft, and the distance between the two women now was not just the distance of different positions in a cabin, but the distance of two people who had just discovered they were on different sides of something important, something that could not be bridged with the ordinary language of professional collegiality. Claire sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on nothing in particular, and she was doing the kind of thinking that happens after the decisions have already been made and cannot be unmade, not planning, not strategizing, but reckoning the plain and unavoidable reckoning of someone who was being forced to see something she had not let herself see clearly for a very long time. She had worked for this airline for 14 years. She had a shelf at home with 3 consecutive years of excellent performance reviews. She had a uniform that fit her well and a route she knew by heart and colleagues who trusted her and passengers who remembered her name, and she had been certain not in a conscious, examined way, but in the deeper and more dangerous way of assumptions that had never been challenged, that these things meant she was doing her job right. She had looked at the child in seat 2. 8 years old in a white dress with navy stars, a backpack covered in constellation patches, a green notebook in her lap and a satellite phone in her hand. And she had expected the child to be manageable, the way children were manageable in confined spaces, the way passengers were manageable when you had been doing this long enough to know which pressure points produced compliance. And what she had found instead was something that had not felt manageable at all, and something that she was still even now sitting in the jump seat with the curtain closed and the plane emptying around her trying to fully understand. Some of what she was feeling was what she had expected to feel, the cold fear of professional consequences, the familiar dread of the machinery of accountability beginning to turn. But some of it, and this was the part she had not been prepared for, was something else. A kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with the length of the flight. A feeling of setting something down that had been too heavy for too long. She did not have a name for that yet. She wasn't ready to name it. Patricia Adeyemi listened the way lawyers listened when they were being given something they intended to use without interrupting, without reacting, without allowing any expression to cross her face that might shape the testimony of the person in front of her, because she had learned over 20 years of practice that the most dangerous thing a lawyer could do while receiving a witness account was make it feel like it was being received in a particular direction, because accounts bent toward where they felt welcomed, and she didn't want bending, she wanted raw. Zoe spoke the way she had written all afternoon. Clean lines, precise details, no editorializing the facts arranged in the sequence they had occurred without decoration or emotional framing. She gave Patricia everything from the first water request that went unanswered all the way to Claire, standing at the exit door with her jaw working and her eyes bright and no words, and she gave her Grace's notepad still in its original form, with Grace's pressed handwriting covering 3 pages front and back, and she gave her Judge Finch's business card, and she gave her Darnell's name and Dr. Hayes's name and the row numbers and the timestamps, all of it in 9 minutes. When Zoe finished, Patricia was quiet for a moment that had nothing restful in it. The quiet of someone measuring, organizing, building the architecture of what they had just received. She looked at the notepad in her hand. She looked at the green notebook. She looked at the business card from a retired federal judge that an 8-year-old had been handed by the man himself in the deplaning process. "Okay," she said. She stood from her crouch. She looked at Dominic. "You know what you have here. Tell me anyway," he said. "I want to hear your words." Patricia spoke in the precise, unhurried cadence she used when she wanted something to be heard rather than absorbed. "You have a documented pattern of racially discriminatory conduct by a named Transcontinental Airlines employee, corroborated by 4 independent witnesses. 1, a former federal jurist, 1, a physician, 1, the airline's own crew member, 1, a senior professional who was himself a subject of the conduct, all of whom are independently creating contemporaneous records. You have time-stamped documentation created in real time during the incident. You have a call with the airline's CEO that established corporate awareness of the situation before the aircraft landed." She paused. "And you have an 8-year-old who gave the person responsible a documented opportunity to self-correct before she escalated." Another pause, this one with a different quality. "That last part is not nothing. That last part is actually everything." Zoe. "Why? Because it removes every argument that this was a miscommunication or an overreaction," Patricia said, looking at her directly. "You didn't go around her. You went to her first. You told her what you had observed. You asked her to make it right. She refused in front of witnesses, having been given every opportunity to choose differently. That sequence, that specific order of events, is the difference between a complaint and a case." They moved through the terminal together, Patricia leading with the brisk forward momentum of a woman who had been waiting at a gate for 45 minutes and was now in full operational mode, phone in one hand, legal pad in the other. The particular velocity of someone who had information and knew exactly what to do with it. Patricia made 3 calls. The first was to her paralegal names, dates, flight numbers, instructions to pull Transcontinental's public complaint record, and any previous discrimination settlements delivered in the rapid shorthand language of someone accustomed to transmitting complex information quickly. The second was to a colleague who specialized in employment law, 30 seconds exchanged in each direction. The third call came in before she could make it Calloway's office. She answered, listened, her posture shifting in the direction of heightened attention, said, "I see and when, and will be available," and ended the call. That was Calloway's deputy general counsel, she said, and her voice had the quality of someone carrying news that had more than one edge to it. "They want a meeting tonight here at the airport." Calloway called his legal team within 10 minutes of speaking with Zoe. "They have been in session for the past hour and a half." Dominic. "That's fast. Very fast," Patricia confirmed, "which tells you exactly what they think they're looking at." Zoe. "What does it mean?" Patricia looked at her directly, the way she always looked at people when she was about to say something they needed to hear clearly rather than gently. "It means James Calloway is a man who understands the difference between a situation that can be managed quietly and a situation that cannot. And he has decided this is the second kind." She paused. "It also means someone on that legal team ran a search on your father's name and understood that an incident involving the Osei family is not a complaint they file and forget." Zoe sat with this for a moment. "I don't want it to be about who my father is," she said carefully. "I want it to be about what she did." "It will be both," Patricia said, and she did not soften it. "I won't lie to you about that." Your father's position changes how quickly they move and how seriously they respond. But the substance, the facts, the documentation, the pattern, Grace's statement that stands entirely on its own. One doesn't cancel the other. Zoe looked at her for a moment, processing this with the thorough honesty she applied to all things she needed to actually understand rather than simply accept. "Okay," she said finally. Then in a voice that was quiet but clear, "As long as the people she hurt, Darnell, Dr. Hayes, the ones Grace wrote about, as long as they are part of this. Not just us. They deserve to be part of this." Something passed between Patricia and Dominic. Not surprise exactly, but the specific recognition that came when you watched a child say something that most adults never got around to saying, the thing that was supposed to be the last consideration, but was being offered as the first. "That will be in our terms," Patricia said. "I'll make it explicit and non-negotiable." The meeting was set for 7 p.m., and before it began, Dominic took Zoe to a restaurant on the concourse level and ordered her pasta and a glass of water because she had never received her water on the flight and had eaten approximately nothing since Los Angeles, and when the water arrived, she held it for a moment before drinking it in the unceremonious, grateful way of a person who had been waiting a long time for something very ordinary. They ate in the quiet that existed between them when they didn't need words to feel connected. And after a few minutes, Dominic said carefully, "When Claire grabbed your arm before you came back to your seat, why didn't you tell me?" Zoe set down her fork and thought about this honestly, the way she thought about things she wanted to answer truthfully rather than just answer. "Because if I had told you right then," she said, "you would have handled it. And I needed to handle it." He waited. "If you had stepped in, it becomes your story," she said. "A powerful man confronting a flight attendant. That's a different story than what actually happened." She looked at him steadily. What actually happened is that she grabbed a child's arm because she was afraid of the child, and the child didn't cry, and didn't run, and didn't need rescuing. That's the real story. I needed it to stay that. Dominic looked at his daughter across the small restaurant table, the plates of pasta between them and the concourse moving past outside the window with its ordinary airport urgency. And something in his expression did the quiet thing it did when she said something that was too true to respond to immediately. "Your arm," he said softly. "Did she hurt you?" "She startled me," Zoe said. "She didn't hurt me. And I think she knew the second she did it that she had just made everything significantly worse for herself." "She had," Dominic said. They went back to the conference room Patricia had booked in the airline's business lounge, and at 6:58 p.m., Calloway's team arrived 3 people, Stephen Park Deputy General Counsel, compact, and contained with the specific composure of someone who had managed difficult corporate situations many times and knew how to set a tone. Deborah Ames, Senior HR Director, precise and watchful in a way that was different from Stephen Park's watchfulness, more human in its quality. And a younger attorney, whose job was clearly to take notes and who did it with attentive efficiency. They arrived with the contained energy of people who were managing something and knew it, and Zoe registered the difference between that energy and the energy of people who were losing something. The former was controlled and strategic. The latter was desperate, and these 3 people were not desperate. Stephen Park opened with the practiced language of corporate acknowledgement, deeply concerning, contrary to everything Transcontinental stood for, immediate review initiated. And Patricia said pleasantly but without warmth, "Let's move to specifics." The rhythm of the meeting established itself quickly. Park presenting Patricia, redirecting Deborah, occasionally inserting HR language shaped with the precision of someone acknowledging wrongdoing without building unnecessary exposure, and Dominic sat with his hands folded and said almost nothing, because he had learned long ago that his presence in rooms was itself a kind of argument that did not require him to speak, and that speaking when presence was enough was wasteful. Zoe had her notebook open. She wrote, At 7:23, Patricia put down her pen and said, "I want to be transparent about what my clients are seeking." She let the pause do work. First, a formal acknowledgement from Transcontinental Airlines that discriminatory conduct occurred on Flight 1174. Not a statement expressing regret for any discomfort experienced. An acknowledgement. Second, a substantive review, not a procedural one, of Ms. Hartley's complete service history, with particular attention to the 4 prior incidents documented in the written statement provided by your own crew member, which I will be submitting formally tonight. Another pause. Third, every affected passenger named in that statement and in Grace Okonkwo's documentation of prior incidents must be identified and personally contacted by the airline within 72 hours. Personal contact, not a form letter with a direct apology and an offer of remedy. Park began to respond, and Patricia continued. And fourth, this airline currently has no formal bias training requirement for senior cabin crew. That changes. That is a condition, not a preference. The room was quiet. Then Deborah Ames did something no one expected. She turned and looked at Zoe directly, and specifically at Zoe, rather than at Patricia or Dominic, and said, "I want to ask you something directly, if that's all right." Patricia gave a small nod. "When you spoke to Mr. Calloway on the plane," Deborah said before the apology, before any of this formal process, "what were you hoping for? What did you actually want to happen?" Every face in the room turned toward Zoe. Zoe closed her notebook. She sat with the question for a moment in the way she sat with questions that deserved real answers rather than fast ones. "I wanted her to understand what she did," Zoe said. "Not to get in trouble, not to lose her job. I wanted her to actually understand it, because I think she didn't. I think she had been doing it for so long that it had become invisible to her, just part of how she moved through the world. And invisible things don't change. They just keep going." She paused, and the pause was not for effect, but because she was still thinking, and she had never been the kind of person who spoke before the thought was finished. But I also knew that wanting that and getting that were probably 2 different things. So I documented everything, because if she wouldn't change on her own, then something else had to create the conditions for it. The documentation was the something else. Deborah looked at Zoe for a long time. She had come into this room expecting a negotiation of the kind she had conducted hundreds of times, a familiar dance with a predictable shape, and she had received instead something she hadn't prepared for and wasn't entirely sure how to categorize. "How old are you?" Deborah said, and it sounded like a genuine question rather than a rhetorical one. 8, Zoe said. "Almost 8.5. Deborah wrote something on her notepad that Zoe couldn't see. Then she looked at Dominic, and then she looked back at her own notes, and she did not say anything else for the rest of the meeting that was not entirely professional. The meeting concluded at 8:47 p.m. Patricia walked Calloway's team to the door, exchanged final words with Stephen Park in the low, direct language of people who had just agreed to things that would be binding, and came back to the table with the expression of someone who had closed something significant and was still in the process of taking its measure. "They're going to move fast," she said. "Faster than they would for almost any other complaint, and we both know why. But the substance is solid regardless." She looked at Zoe. "The other passengers will be directly contacted." I pushed until the language was specific and the timeline was enforceable, not vague. The training requirement they resisted for 7 minutes and then accepted. I believe Deborah Ames was on our side by the middle of the meeting. Zoe. "What changed her?" Patricia looked at her steadily. "You did, when she asked what you wanted and you told her the truth, not the strategic answer, not the answer that would play best in a legal proceeding, but the actual answer, the one about wanting her to understand. She has managed complaints for 20 years. Nobody has ever said that to her first. Everyone says it last, if they say it at all. You said it first because it was the most true thing and she recognized it. She paused. In about 20 years, I'm either going to be working with this child or against her. I am genuinely, sincerely hoping it's with. Dominic smiled with the private fullness of a father who had been hearing versions of this his daughter's entire life. Get in line, he said. Zoe was almost asleep in the back of the car by 8:59 p.m., which was reasonable given that she had been awake since before 5 a.m. California time and had spent the last 6 hours in a state of sustained concentration that would have depleted most adults entirely, and she had her green notebook in her lap, even in sleep, her fingers loosely around it, not letting go, which was the kind of small detail that Dominic filed away in the part of his memory reserved for things that mattered. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, an unknown number, and read the message twice before he fully understood who it was from. The name at the top was Claire Hartley, and the message below it said, I know this doesn't change anything, but I want you to know that I heard what your daughter said today. I mean, really heard it. I don't know what I'm going to do with that yet, but I heard it. Dominic held the phone and looked at the message for a long time. And then he looked at his daughter's face in the light of the passing city, the particular unguarded peace of a sleeping child, the composure and precision of the afternoon entirely set aside. Just a girl, just his girl, 8 years old and exhausted and holding her notebook, even in sleep. Because that was the kind of person she was, the kind who held on to the things that mattered even when she wasn't awake enough to know she was doing it. He typed one line. She'll be glad to know that. I'll tell her in the morning. He sent it. He reached over and gently adjusted the notebook in her hands so she was holding it more comfortably, and then he sat back and looked out at the city she had just made a small but permanent mark upon. He did not sleep. He was too full of something for sleep, something that sat right at the border of pride and grief. The specific feeling of watching your child step into the world's difficulty and not flinch, and understanding that the same quality that filled you with awe was the quality that meant they would face hard things again and again, and that there was nothing you could do about that, and nothing you would change about it, even if you could. Morning. Zoe woke at 6:14 a.m. with the notebook still in her hands, and in the first full second of waking she remembered everything. Not in fragments, not in the blurry reconstruction of most morning memories, but whole and complete, and exactly as it had been, like something that had been running in the background all night and loaded the moment she opened her eyes. Dominic was in the chair by the window with his laptop open and a cup of coffee on the table beside him, already working in the way he was always already working, and he looked up when she moved. She asked about Claire's message before she asked anything else. He told her. She sat with it for a moment, looking at her notebook in her hands. Patricia sent the formal interim commitments at 11:47 last night, Dominic said. Transcontinental signed off at 12:32 a.m. He turned his laptop toward her. They moved fast. Zoe read the document with the same tracking attention she had given everything that mattered, clause by clause, sentence by sentence, and she found 2 places where the language was softer than she wanted and pointed at both without speaking. Dominic confirmed that Patricia had flagged both and was pushing for tighter wording before the final signature. At 9:37 a.m., Dominic's communications director called. Her voice had the pitch of someone who had been watching something develop for 2 hours and could no longer responsibly wait. There's a video, she said. Posted last night. Someone on the flight recorded part of the confrontation. It shows Zoe in the aisle addressing the flight attendant. It shows the flight attendant walking away. A pause. It's been up for 11 hours. It has 4 million views. The room went still. Patricia, who had just arrived with her 2 associates, pulled up the video on her phone and turned the screen around. Zoe watched herself, and it was strange in the way it was always strange to see yourself from outside a moment you experienced from within the shaky phone footage shot from somewhere in rows 3 or 4, the cabin background. She recognized her own posture from an angle she had never seen it from the absolute stillness of how she had stood in the aisle. You couldn't hear every word clearly, but you could see her face, and you could see Claire's face cycling through dismissal and contempt and something fractured at the edges. And then this was the part Zoe had not known was recorded. Claire's hand reaching out and gripping her arm. The grip lasted 2 seconds, and Zoe did not move, and she looked down at the hand on her arm and then back up at Claire's face with an expression that even on a shaky phone video in a low-resolution recording communicated something so specific and so complete that it needed no explanation. You have just shown everyone exactly what you are. Then Claire let go. Then Zoe walked back to her seat. Patricia set her phone face down on the table. The grip she said quietly to Dominic. That changes the legal dimension significantly. Zoe was already thinking about something else. The people in the comments, she said. The ones sharing their own stories. Is there a way to make sure this doesn't just become about the video, about the moment, and then disappear? Is there a way to make it about what actually changes? Patricia looked at her. What are you thinking? The people who watch this and recognize themselves in it? Zoe said slowly, working through the thought as she said it. Not just the people who were treated the way Darnell and Dr. Hayes were treated. The people who were treated like the other passengers on the flight, the ones who watched and said nothing. They're going to feel something watching this. And feeling something and doing something are different. I want there to be somewhere for the feeling to go. Kira, the young associate, who had sat quietly through the morning document review until she'd spoken up about the contract language, said almost to herself but audibly, a formal avenue. A visible commitment from the airline that reports are taken seriously and result in something real, not hidden in a policy document on page 40 of a website, prominent, named, with a deadline. That becomes part of the final agreement, Patricia said immediately, already uncapping her pen. She looked at Dominic. You're thinking bigger than one airline. The video is going to reach every major carrier by end of business today, Dominic said in the forward-building tone of someone whose mind had moved from problem to possibility. What happened on one flight in one cabin is going to become a conversation about what happens in every flight in every cabin. That's an opportunity that's larger than transcontinental. Zoe. Will they listen? They'll have to, he said. Because the thing that makes institutions listen is not arguments, it's attention. And right now, there is a great deal of attention. He was right about that. By noon, the video had reached 9 million views. By 3 p.m., it was 14 million. The coverage moved from digital platforms to networks, in the way that certain stories moved, not because anyone pushed them, but because the story had the specific gravity that pulled coverage toward it, the kind that came from being true and being visible simultaneously. By 4 p.m., 3 major airlines had issued public statements. By 5 p.m., 2 senators had spoken. By 6 p.m., James Calloway had released something that Patricia recognized immediately as a personal statement rather than a corporate one. His name, his voice, no hedging language, no qualifiers, in which he used the word discrimination without softening it, and committed transcontinental to a set of specific named deadline-attached reforms that were word for word the commitments from the signed agreement Patricia had in her files. He had chosen not to put out something softer. He had gone on the record with language that had actual teeth. Patricia called Dominic. He didn't have to do it that way, she said. He could have released something with more cushion. He chose not to. Why? Because an 8-year-old girl told his deputy HR director that the first thing she wanted was for the person to understand, Patricia said. And I think that landed somewhere it wasn't expected to land. A pause. Also, 14 million views by end of business clarifies a person's values considerably, Dominic told Zoe. She was sitting at the hotel desk, with her green notebook open, not writing documentation, something else, something longer that had been building since the plane landed, the kind of writing that came from somewhere different than the evidence pages. She looked up when Dominic relayed Patricia's words and was quiet for a moment. "Dad," she said, "I want to write letters. To who? To Darnell, to Dr. Hayes, to Judge Finch." A pause. "And to Grace." "What kind of letters?" "Not thank you letters exactly," she said, searching for the precise word, the right container for what she meant. "Acknowledgement letters. I want them to know that what they did mattered, that the choices they made were real choices, and that real choices deserve to be named." She looked at her father. "They were all part of it. I don't want them to feel like the background of my story. They were their own stories. I want them to know that I know that." Dominic sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his daughter, this child who had been awake for 36 hours, who had watched herself in a video that 14 million people had seen, who was sitting at a hotel desk at 6:30 in the evening. After all of that writing, acknowledgement letters, because she did not want the people who had helped her to feel like they were background characters in someone else's narrative. He did not trust his voice for a moment. "I'll get the addresses," he said. She wrote all 4 letters that evening, and they were not long, and they were not performative, and they were exactly what she had said they were. Grace's letter was the last one she wrote, and the longest 3 paragraphs in her small and careful hand, and the final paragraph said, "You were afraid, and you did it anyway. Most people will never know how hard that is because most people will never let themselves find out. But you did. And because you did, the pattern became visible. Visible things can change. You made this more than one incident. You made it a case. I want you to know that I understand that and I am grateful for it." She sealed each envelope herself. Patricia arrived at the hotel at 8:15 the next morning with her 2 associates, Kira and a tall man named James, who carried files with the efficiency of someone accustomed to carrying files that mattered. And she spread the printed, revised interim commitments across the table and walked Dominic through each clause, and then pointedly, deliberately, with the full attention she gave things she meant, turned to Zoe and walked her through them too, not as a summary, not as a simplified version, but as the actual document clause by clause and sentence by sentence, the way she would have walked a junior colleague through a contract they were going to have to sign off on. "This one," Zoe said. She was pointing to Section 3, Paragraph 2, and Patricia looked at where she was pointing. "What about it?" "It says the airline will make reasonable efforts to contact affected passengers," Zoe said, reading the precise language. "Reasonable efforts isn't a standard. It's a phrase that means whatever they need it to mean when the time comes and the inconvenience has grown. Reasonable efforts is how you satisfy the letter of a commitment without fulfilling the spirit of it." Patricia looked at Kira. Kira looked down at the document, then up with the expression of someone who had been shown something they should have caught independently and knew it. "She's right," Kira said. "I know she's right," Patricia said, and she was already uncapping her pen. "I flagged it last night and they pushed back. I'll push harder. My father says reasonable efforts is lawyer language for we'll try if it's convenient," Zoe said. Patricia looked at Dominic with a look that had several layers in it. "Did you teach her that?" "She read it in your brief from the Hendricks case," Dominic said. "The one you left on the kitchen counter when you came to dinner in July." Patricia looked at him, then she looked at Zoe, then she looked back at Dominic. "She reads your legal briefs. She reads everything." The clause was revised. Patricia made 2 phone calls that were brief and specific and produced the result she wanted, and by 9 a.m. the final interim commitments had been signed, scanned, and filed. Section 3, Paragraph 2 now read, "The airline will directly contact each identified affected passenger by name via personal phone call within 72 hours of the signing of this agreement. Not reasonable efforts. Direct contact, by name, with a deadline." Zoe sat with that revision for a moment, holding it the way she held things that mattered. Not celebrating it, just feeling the difference between what it had said before and what it said now. The distance between a gesture and an obligation, which was exactly the distance between something that might happen and something that had to. Patricia's phone rang before she could speak. She looked at the screen Deborah Ames and answered, listened, said 3 words in the precise cadence of someone receiving information they needed to receive carefully, and ended the call. She set the phone on the table. That was Deborah Ames from Transcontinental HR, she said, and her voice had the quality of someone carrying news that belonged to more than one category. She called to inform us that Claire Hartley will not be contesting her suspension. A pause. And that this morning at approximately 7 a.m., before any formal requirement and on her own initiative, Claire Hartley requested a meeting with the airline's Employee Assistance Program. The room was quiet. Dominic looked at Zoe. Zoe was looking at her hands, and she was thinking about a flight attendant standing at an exit door with bright eyes and no words, and a message sent from an unknown number the previous night to a phone that should not have had her father's number in it, and what it meant when someone reached toward something better, not because they were required to, but because something had finally moved in them, shifted something that had been fixed for a long time. Good, Zoe said softly. Just the one word. Nobody added anything to it because some things didn't need additions. They were already complete in themselves, and anything placed after them would only reduce what they held. If this story has moved you, please subscribe to our channel and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from, because stories like this one deserve to travel as far as possible. Hit the like button if you believe that documentation is one of the most powerful tools a person can carry. And keep watching because we're just getting started. The morning light in New York was the particular clear and unhurried light of early spring, the kind that arrived at an angle that made familiar things look slightly more precise than they usually did, as if overnight the world had been cleaned. And when Zoe and Dominic walked into the conference room on the 32nd floor of Transcontinental Airlines' Midtown Manhattan headquarters at 8:47 a.m., the walls were lined with framed route maps from 60 years of the airline's history, and the maps were the kind of beautiful that maps were when they showed how connected things were, rather than how far apart. James Calloway was already there, which told Zoe something because in rooms like this, rooms where things were decided, the person who was already there when you arrived was communicating something about how they understood the meeting before it had begun. He was smaller in person than his voice had suggested on the phone, which was sometimes the way with people who carried significant authority. The voice became a kind of architecture that the person then had to inhabit in the flesh, and the flesh was occasionally less than the architecture. He was compact and gray-haired and in his early 60s with reading glasses on a chain around his neck and the handshake of someone who had been in rooms like this for decades, and still understood that a handshake was a statement rather than a formality. He shook Dominic's hand, and then he turned to Zoe and crouched, not all the way to eye level, but enough the deliberate angle of a man who understood who the important person in the room was and wanted his body to say so, and extended his hand. "Miss Osei," he said, "I believe we spoke on the phone." "We did," Zoe said, and shook his hand with the seriousness it deserved. He looked at her, really looked the same recalibration she had seen in every adult who encountered her in a professional context for the first time, the adjustment of expectation that happened when reality declined to match the category it had been placed in. And he said, in the voice of a man who had been preparing this sentence for 18 hours and had finally found the right version of it, "I have been running this airline for 11 years. In that time, I have received thousands of complaints. I have read reports and launched investigations and sat in rooms like this many times. And I want to tell you honestly, in 11 years, not one of those complaints was delivered to me the way yours was." He was still crouched still at her level. The clarity of it. The sequence. The fact that you went to her first before you called me. The documentation. Another pause. My legal team thought I was being dramatic when I told them it was the most well-constructed complaint I had ever received. They changed their minds when they read the notebook. It wasn't about being well-constructed, Zoe said carefully. It was about making sure the truth was accurate so that nobody could say it wasn't. Calloway held her gaze. Those are the same thing he said. Done right. They sat, and the meeting was different from the airport meeting in the way that certain second conversations differed from first ones, because the positions had already been taken and the formal language had already been used, and what remained was the actual work, the construction of something real, rather than the negotiation of terms. Calloway had brought Deborah Ames and 2 senior operations directors, and he had also brought something that nobody in Patricia's team had anticipated, a written proposal already drafted for a new passenger advocacy program. Trained advocates, a dedicated role with explicit authority, placed on every transcontinental flight within an 18-month timeline, empowered specifically to see what Zoe had seen and act on it in real time. He slid it across the table without preamble. Zoe read it. Dominic read it. Patricia read it. The 18 months, Zoe said. Can it be 12? Calloway looked at Farah Nkosi, one of the operations directors. Close-cropped gray hair, the steady problem-solver energy of someone who had spent decades figuring out how to make things work rather than explaining why they couldn't. Piloting in major hubs could be completed in 9 months, Farah said. Full fleet in 12 is achievable if we prioritize the resourcing now rather than later. 9 in 12, Zoe said. Pilot in 9, full fleet in 12. Calloway looked at her for a moment that had something in it beyond assessment, something closer to recognition, and then looked at Farah. Make it work, he said, and Farah wrote it down with the decisiveness of someone who had been waiting for permission to do what she already knew was possible. They worked for 2 hours, and when the final agreement was signed, the real one complete with specific language and dates and accountability structures and the passenger advocacy program and all of it, Calloway walked them to the elevator himself. At the elevator door, he stopped. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a business card, a personal one. Just his name, and a direct number. Nothing corporate, and held it out to Zoe with the particular deliberateness of a gesture that had been decided on in advance. Not for legal purposes, he said, and for the first time in 2 hours he looked less like a corporate executive managing a situation and more like a man who had been affected by something and was trying to find the right container for it. Not for complaints. If you ever want to know whether we're actually doing what we said we'd do, not from a report, not from a press release from you. Zoe took the card and looked at it and looked at him. I'll follow up in 6 months, she said. He smiled fully with nothing managed about it. I'll be expecting it. The elevator opened. They stepped in. The doors closed. Zoe looked at the card. She looked at her father. In 6 months, she said, I want to check whether Grace still has her job. Dominic took out his phone and sent Patricia 3 words, non-retaliation clause. Grace. Patricia's response arrived in 40 seconds. Already in page 7, paragraph 4. He showed Zoe. She read it, and she exhaled not the careful, controlled breathing of the afternoon on the plane, but the real kind, the kind that started somewhere near the ribs and traveled all the way out. Good, she said. The elevator reached the lobby and they walked out into the morning, the alive, relentless, completely indifferent morning of a city that had no patience for anything that stood still, and Zoe stopped on the sidewalk outside and tilted her head back and looked up at the narrow strip of sky between the buildings, the particular blue of a March morning that sat just above the towers. Dominic stopped beside her. You okay? He asked. She was quiet for a moment, not thinking, just being in the specific fullness of a moment she would carry for a long time, the moment when all the pieces of a thing that had been in motion finally came to rest in something that had the shape of completion. Yeah, she said. I'm okay. She looked at him. Can we get breakfast? I'm actually really hungry. Dominic laughed fully from the chest. The laugh that came after something hard had been completed, and the body finally remembered that ordinary things were still permitted, and they walked side by side, father and daughter, through the morning city. Her hand in his, the green notebook in her other hand, the constellation patches catching the March light. 3 weeks after Flight 1174. Transcontinental Airlines posted the details of their new passenger advocacy program on their public website. A launch timeline, a named director, a complaint portal that was visible and accessible rather than buried, and a guaranteed 48-hour response commitment. The statement accompanying the post was written in James Calloway's name, and it read, in part, "This program was initiated in response to a complaint filed by a passenger whose documentation integrity and moral clarity set a standard we should have been meeting already." He did not name her. She had asked him not to. 2 months later, Grace Okonkwo was promoted to lead flight attendant on Transcontinental's flagship international routes. Her record, clean, her standing within the crew improved by something that had nothing to do with the formal outcome of the investigation, and everything to do with the fact that she had made a choice when it mattered, and the people around her knew it. She sent Zoe a card. It was simple and short and said, "Only because of you, I stopped looking away. Thank you." Darnell Wade called his son Marcus that same evening and told him the whole story. The meal that arrived wronged the flight attendant who had treated him as an afterthought. The math that happened in his head every time he decided whether to say something or swallow it. And he told his son about an 8-year-old girl who had done that same math and arrived at a different answer and had written everything down because her father taught her that if something mattered, paper was more honest than memory. "The math is hard," Darnell told Marcus in the kitchen of their house, his son sitting across the table from him, the way sons sat across tables when they understood that what was being said mattered. "But you can get better at it. You just have to keep doing it, and you can get better." Marcus was 11 years old, and he listened to every word. "Doctor." Simone Hayes opened her keynote at the medical conference in New York the morning after the flight, with 3 minutes about what had happened on the plane, not as an anecdote, but as the frame for everything she had come to say. "I spent 20 years being professionally excellent and personally silent," she said, standing at the podium with the particular confidence of someone who had decided to be honest about something that had cost them something to be honest about. "I met an 8-year-old who showed me that those two things are not the same as being whole." She received a standing ovation. She cried backstage briefly and completely, and she was not embarrassed about either the tears or their brevity. Claire Hartley attended 12 sessions with the Employee Assistance Program over 4 months, and the process was not straightforward and was not comfortable in the way that real processes were never straightforward or comfortable. She resisted through the first 3 sessions, and something shifted in the 4th. The way things shifted in the 4th session when the resistance had finally spent itself, and then the work began in earnest, slow, and genuine. At the end of the 4th month, she wrote a letter. Not to the airline, not to the legal team, not to anyone in the formal machinery of the outcome she was living with. To Zoe. The letter arrived at the Osei family home on a Tuesday morning in an envelope with no return address and handwriting that Dominic did not recognize, and he brought it to Zoe with his expression deliberately and carefully neutral, the specific neutrality of a parent who had decided that this was her thing to decide, and set it on the kitchen table in front of her without a word. She looked at the envelope. She picked it up. She opened it carefully the way she opened things that might need to be put back together. She read it at the kitchen table in the morning light that came through the window at the particular angle of early April, and she read it twice, the first time for what it said, the second time for what it meant, which was sometimes different with letters that had been hard to write. It was long, and it was imperfect, and in several places the language retreated partway into excuse before catching itself and returning with visible effort to something closer to honesty, the imperfect, genuine effort of someone who was trying to say a true thing rather than a comfortable one. There were places where the sentences were clumsy because the feelings behind them were larger than the sentences could hold. There were places where she could feel Claire searching for words, the way people searched for words when what they needed to say had never been said before, and there was no established path for it. The letter ended, "I'm still working on it." But I am working on it. Zoe sat with the letter for a while after she finished reading it the way she sat with things that required sitting. Not analyzing, not documenting, just sitting and feeling the weight of what it meant when someone reached for something they hadn't been able to reach for before, even imperfectly, even slowly, even with the letter showing the effort of every inch. She folded it carefully with the deliberateness of someone treating something fragile. She opened her green notebook, not to the evidence pages, not to the documentation from the flight, but to the back section. The part she kept separate from the records, where she kept the things she wanted to remember, not because they were evidence, but because they were true, and she placed the letter there in that section between other things she had decided deserved to be held. She opened to a fresh page, uncapped her pen, wrote the date at the top in her small, careful hand the way she always wrote the date at the top. Below it, she wrote one line. Some things take time. The important thing is that they move. She capped her pen. She closed the notebook. The morning light moved across the kitchen in the particular way that April morning light moved, and somewhere in the city a street was waking up, and somewhere in the sky the stars that she had catalogued on the patches of her backpack were still there, still burning, still too far away to be properly appreciated, but present, all of them, and traceable to anyone who knew where to look. Zoe picked up her backpack, Orion Cassiopeia the Southern Cross catching the light, and went to school. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us which character stayed with you longest after the credits rolled. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for watching.